Welcome everybody. We're just going to take 1 second and let all of our participants get in before we start. All right. Welcome everyone to this rapid response webinar on COVID-19 and the criminal justice system. Today's topic is fines, fees, and COVID-19. The ABA is working very hard to push critical information about successes out to other jurisdictions so that as a profession, we can help each other through this crisis. And that is what these rapid response webinars are all about. On today's webinar, we're going to be talking about fines and fees. I think we are all aware that both the pandemic and the consequences of the response are disproportionately harming those of lesser means in this country. This webinar, Fines, Fees, and COVID-19, will explore the impacts on those who already have criminal justice debt, what is happening and should be happening with debt collection, as well as the use of fines and fees to enforce compliance with social distancing and other aspects of COVID response. These rapid response webinars are brought to you by the ABA section on civil rights and social justice, the ABA Standing Committee on Legal Aid and Indigent Defendants, and the ABA Criminal Justice section. We're actively planning more rapid response webinars, so please check back with our websites regularly. Now, before we move on to the substance, I want to talk about some of the technical aspects of the webinar. So if you scroll to the bottom of your Zoom panel, you should see a Q&A box or an option for the Q&A box to pop up. We would very much like you to ask questions. We would like you to use the Q&A box to ask those questions. Please do not use the chat function. The Q&A box will let us respond to those questions more easily. Participants, in case you're concerned about this, you cannot be seen. The Q&A box is your means of asking questions, and we'll direct those to your moderator, who will be able to pose them to panelists. On the webinar, the website for the webinar are all the materials for this webinar. That includes policy recommendations as well as examples of advocacy letters. These websites are not static. We will continue to update these materials even after the webinar closes. We're also recording this webinar. Everyone who registered for the webinar will receive an email with a webpage once the recording is available. Please feel free to share the webinar page and the recording and the materials with all of your personal networks. This is free and available to the public, and we would like it shared as widely as possible. Finally, I have to say, this webinar would not be possible without members of the ABA. So if you are already a member, thank you. And if you are not already a member, please consider joining us. We would love for you to come on board and get active. Okay, enough of the technical intro. So I want to get you to substance. And for that, I want to introduce our moderator for today, Joanna Weiss. Joanna is the co-director of the Fines and Fees Justice Center. And Joanna, the floor belongs to you.
Thank you so much, Malia, to you and to the ABA generally. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes setting the stage about what our discussion today is going to be about. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to share my screen so you all can see a couple of slides. Okay, success. Which is a small miracle. As everyone here knows, fines and fees are ubiquitous in the criminal legal system. They attach to nearly every felony, misdemeanor, traffic ticket, and municipal code violation that's issued today and that's imposed today by courts across the country. And as a result, millions of people across this country owe billions of dollars, that's with a B. We don't actually know how much court debt is owed because many states either can't or won't, I'll say usually can't, report how much criminal justice debt is owed. But just as an example, in California, there's over $10 billion in outstanding fines and fees that's owed to the state. In Florida, we don't actually know how much is outstanding. What we do know is how much is imposed each year and how much is collected. So we know the delta each year, but we really have no idea cumulatively how much people owe. But we know that many people can't afford to pay. And one of the reasons we know this is looking at felony convictions with debt associated with felony convictions in Florida. Only 9% of the fines and fees imposed with felony convictions are deemed to be collectible. And in fact, the state budgets that they will get about 7% of what's assessed. Now, there's two main reasons about why we have so many fines and fees today in the system. The first is mass incarceration. As we had more and more people incarcerated or put under court supervision, the costs for states and localities ballooned along with the population. And so states and localities looked for ways of recouping money of the increasing cost of the justice system. The other reason that fines and fees have ballooned really stems from the recession of 2008. With the recession, there was a lack of tax revenue coming in, and states and localities turned increasingly to fines and fees to fill budget gaps. In fact, we know that between 2008 and 2010, 48 out of 50 states raised both the number of fines and fees that they imposed and the amounts of fines and fees. Only North Dakota and Hawaii didn't. And as we've imposed more and more fines and fees, which disproportionately fall on the most vulnerable communities in the United States, mostly poor communities and communities of color, they've become harder and harder to collect. And so courts and government have had to impose heavier and heavier burdens and more draconian punishments in order to try to collect fines and fees imposed. Everything from driver's license suspensions for unpaid fines and fees, and even going to jail. Now we have a new crisis in the United States, the coronavirus crisis, which is unlike any economic or public health crisis that we've seen in modern US history. And like fines and fees, is falling very disproportionately on poor communities and communities of color, both the economic and the health impacts. As the economic impacts continue to grow, people who are living paycheck to paycheck are now losing their jobs and are at risk of losing their homes and are having trouble feeding their families. And so the Fines and Fees Justice Center has put out recommendations to try to address what state and local governments can do to address the fines and fees crisis amidst the pandemic. And we have a series of recommendations. I'm not going to walk through all of them in detail because you're going to all have access to these materials after the session. But in highlights, we're asking that states and local governments to really discharge all of the debt, which is mostly uncollectible, but is really a burden to some of our most vulnerable communities. And in the alternative, all collections should stop right now. We should also stop issuing warrants for failure to pay and failure to appear. We should stop suspending driver's licenses, which people need in order to access their basic necessities and work without fear of arrest. And we should be reinstating licenses that have been suspended for non-public safety reasons. We should stop issuing parking tickets and municipal code violations because people can ill afford to pay them during the crisis. Judges should waive and reduce fines that they impose and recognize people's precarious financial circumstance. And any reforms that are made should be made public and widely available so people know that they are not at risk of arrest or other justice system involvement simply on the basis of fines and fees. We've also issued some fines and fees recommendations specifically for people who are currently involved in the criminal legal system, including ending co-pays for medical visits right now. Everyone needs to access medical care. We need to be providing people who are incarcerated with free soap and hand sanitizer and disinfecting products. We should also be providing everyone with free phone calls to make sure that they can stay in touch with their loved ones. We should be releasing anyone who's incarcerated for fines and fees, and parole and probation should never be extended or revoked for unpaid fines and fees or other technical violations. The other thing we're doing is we are trying to track what's happening around the country right now, and we'll go into further detail of that during the discussion. But we have a tracker on our website that shows some of the things that state and local governments have done in the wake of the crisis. There are examples like Vermont, which has vacated 12,500 warrants for failure to pay fines and fees or failure to appear. There are cities in Pennsylvania and in New York and in California that have stopped issuing a host of municipal code violations and stopped impounding cars for unpaid fines and fees. There are a number of states and some localities in Florida which have stopped suspending driver's licenses. And those are the kinds of things that we have put up in this tracker so that other states and localities can replicate those efforts. We've also put together a bank of advocacy materials of what groups around the country are doing to encourage their government to do the right thing in terms of fines and fees in the wake of the crisis. And I just wanted to highlight that, you know, all of these materials exist on our website. You're free to find them. And I just wanted to frame the discussion that we're going to have right now, because I think there's two other issues that I hope that we will get to in this conversation. One is enforcement of stay-at-home and social distancing orders and what those look like, and whether or not those are going to raise other problems for people who are vulnerable to fines and fees, as well as the COVID crisis. And the other thing I want to make sure that we touch on is what happens when legislatures are back in session and they're facing budget gaps, and how do we avoid the same outcomes that we saw in 2008, and making sure that fines and fees don't become a way of plugging holes in the budget. So with that all being said, I want to introduce the wonderful panelists we have very briefly. First, we have Anthony Robles, who is an organizer with Los Angeles's Youth Justice Coalition. We have Stephanie Campos-Bui, who is the clinical supervising attorney at the Berkeley Policy Advocacy Clinic at Berkeley Law School. And we have Judge Jack Tuter, who serves as the chief judge of the 17th Judicial District, which is Broward County, Florida. It's the second largest judicial circuit for the state of Florida. So thank you all for being here. And I really would love to keep this as conversational as possible. So I am going to throw out some questions to you, and I know we're going to get questions from the audience, which we'll mix in with some of the ones that I thought about that we should make sure we discuss today. So to get us started, Anthony, I'm going to turn to you first. You've personally been involved in the criminal legal system. Can you talk about how fines and fees have impacted your life generally, and especially how owing fines and fees has affected you and other people in the community during the COVID-19 crisis?
Yeah, hey everybody, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here and be talking to people from across the country who are interested in this advocacy work that's going on. It means a lot, and I'm hoping that, you know, we build a national movement to really end these punitive and draconian and really economically debilitating practices that affect mostly Black and brown people and low-income communities. But yeah, so I've been impacted by, me and my family have been impacted by juvenile and criminal system fees since I can remember. Starting with my father, who was arrested and incarcerated a couple times. My brother, who was arrested and incarcerated multiple times as a youth and an adult. And then same with me. So my family's always been saddled with this debt. And even during times I can remember growing up, we were evicted from our apartment, and my dad was just incarcerated and soon to be deported after. And we got evicted because he was the main breadwinner of the house, and we lost money, and our family was my brother started hanging out like with his friends outside more and getting into trouble after that. And so we got evicted, and then my brother got arrested and convicted for stealing at a 7-Eleven and did 4 months in camps for stealing at a 7-Eleven. And all that was in the early 2000s. all that, the restitution you had to pay, the fees and all the other fines associated with that conviction were put on top of while he was incarcerated, put on my mom had to deal with. And we were homeless at the time, and then eventually started living with my grandma. And so it just added a lot of financial and emotional stress to an already stressful time. Us, a family in transition with unstable housing, and a broken family. My dad was gone, now my brother's gone. So the fees and the fines on top of that just add, and they're really unnecessary and really punitive, and just add to an already stressful moment. Because when anybody, a family member, anybody is going through the system, it's stressful for everybody involved. You know, there's a famous saying that, you know, that the person doing time isn't the only one doing time. The family does time too, because they're suffering. And some people debate that, because, you know, it's a big difference between in jail or prison and outside, but it's still like describes the suffering that families go through. So that was like my early experiences with it. And then growing up, as I became, even before I was a teenager, I was involved with the juvenile system, and saddled with fees and fines, and my license being suspended before I was even able to drive. My license was suspended at like 13 years old before I was even able to legally get a license, or even a permit. So by the time I turned 18, I owed $2,000 in juvenile debt that I had to pay before I could even get my license. And so I started working, and I saved up for a car, but I didn't have a license, and I couldn't get a license because I didn't have the money to pay off. So I was driving without a license, going to work for a few months, probably like 4 to 6 months, like something like that. And luckily I was never caught. And eventually my mom helped me pay off that $2,000 debt, and I was able to get my license. And then then I was arrested and incarcerated a little bit after that. And when I came out, I was on probation for 3 years and charged with $4,000 in probation fees. Just the fees, doesn't count including the fines and all the other fees on top of that. $4,000 for probation supervision fees for a 3-year term. And I had a felony on my record, so I couldn't get a job. I was going to community college, and I was just getting the financial aid, and I was getting welfare checks, like food stamps, to help support me. And I was living at my grandma's house in a little corner of her living room. That's all I had, and all I had was my clothes to my name in my car. And $50 a month for 3 years to probation for I don't know what. They never provided any services for me, never helped me find a job, never helped me get into school, never supported me through school, anything like that. It was just like, oh, check in, and as long as I'm not getting in trouble, I had no police contact, I'm good. But I'm paying $50 to them every month. But I didn't pay it for a whole year because I couldn't. $50 represented like 15 to 20% of my monthly income, because I was broke at the time. And so I wasn't paying it. And after a year, they sent me a letter in the mail saying that if I didn't make a payment, then I'm gonna have a court hearing and possibly be violated. So I went in immediately to see my probation officer, and I put I think $20 down, and I was like, I don't want to get violated. I want to have this court hearing, but I can't afford this every month. What can I do? And it wasn't until then, a whole year later, that my probation officer told me that I can have a financial evaluation hearing. So she had never told me, from the first day that I could have one. I had to go in there and say that I can't afford it, and then they offered a financial evaluation hearing. So me, not having any stable work because of my record, and going to community college full time, and only getting that financial aid check that doesn't last throughout the year, and then a little bit of sustenance through welfare. When they did the financial evaluation hearing, they didn't find that I couldn't pay it all. They said I could still pay half, and so they cut the total down to $2,000 and the monthly payment to $25 a month, which represented about 10% of my monthly income. So I had to make those payments, and so I started making those payments, and it just represented a huge burden and frustration in my life. And a lot of times I felt like giving up and just leaving school and just, what's the point? And so, yeah, that's just one story out of thousands and thousands and millions probably in this country that people go through. And then currently right now I'm in a financial and system problem, and not through the criminal system, but through the traffic system. Back in last July, I was stopped. And I would say I was racially profiled because I stopped at a stop sign and the cop was on the opposite side of me. And then I kept going and he busted a U-turn. And then he pulls me over for having a broken back tail light. And I don't know how he could have seen that broken back tail light from in front of me because he busted a U-turn to get behind me. And so he pulls me over for the tail light, gives me a fix-it ticket and lets me go. I repaired my tail light, but I forgot about the court date, and I didn't go to court, so I had an FTA, I had a failure to appear, and I didn't even know about it, and I never got the letter in the mail for whatever reason. I didn't see, then they sent me a second letter, and I didn't see that letter until a day too late, where they told me since I had an FTA and I never got it handled, now it's going to collections and my license is suspended, and I have to pay off collections to get my license. And I was like, so a couple months ago, like 2 months ago, one of our partners that we work with from public counsel, she helped me out and said, I can get you an arraignment. You won't get your license reinstated, but I can get you an arraignment, so you don't have to pay collections and then hopefully just get it dismissed and show them that you fixed it. And I don't even drive the car right now because I don't have a license. And so that was scheduled, that arraignment, she got me the arraignment, was scheduled for April 9th. But COVID crisis happened back last month in March is when they started shutting the courts down on March 13th here in LA County. And now it's been rescheduled to July, and I can't get my license reinstated at least until July, until I go to that arraignment hearing for a fix-it ticket, for a failure to appear on a fix-it ticket that I repaired on a car I'm not even driving. And so I can't drive and now I'm stuck. And that's why I think it's really important for those demands that you had stated, that at least all those demands are great. And for me, in my particular situation, especially the one about reinstating licenses and not suspending licenses for things like failures to appear or failure to pay or things like that in this time.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for sharing that. Judge Tuter, the 17th Judicial District issued orders addressing the payments of fines and fees during the crisis. Can you describe those orders and why those are important, why it was important to do that?
Okay, well, we've had some experience down here with hurricanes. So some of these issues that came up about extending deadlines and fines and fees and other things, we kind of addressed in previous years when we had a hurricane. But hurricanes, for the most part, kept us out of business 2 or 3 weeks. This particular situation is so peculiar and so unique. None of us had any idea what this would bring as we got into this. But what we did essentially was we entered some administrative orders which directed the clerk not to issue what's called a D6 license suspension here under any circumstances or by default on a defendant for a traffic infraction. The clerk also was not to default or issue a D6 license suspension on any defendant who is currently on a payment plan until further order of the court. And we also, the clerk of court here she's pretty good about these things. I mean, you could get a payment plan down here for $5 a month if you're working, and that would reinstate your license and you would still be able to have a valid license. She also extended in county criminal and traffic infractions 60 to 120 days out for them to pay the fine or fee. I got kind of involved with this when I took over as chief judge, looking at the jail population and why so many people were in the jail on low bonds. And all of these things kind of meshed together. It was not only low bonds, but we had a whole bunch of people who were charged with municipal ordinance violations or quality of life problems down here. We have a big homeless population, not near what some of the urban areas that other folks in this call are on. But it was something where we were just cycling, arresting people for, sleeping in the park and those kinds of violations, taking them to the county jail. They, of course, couldn't pay a bond. They, of course, couldn't pay a fine. And so we tried to look at this from a different perspective. We created a community court, which permitted us to take all of those municipal ordinance violation cases and circle them through a therapeutic court to see if we can get those folks off alcohol or drugs, get them employed, and try a different approach to what was a failing enterprise. We do 2 traffic clinics a year down here, just voluntarily, I guess, so to speak. When I saw that we were suspending 40,000 people's licenses every month just in Broward County, I was just kind of shocked. And we're doing everything we can to try to stabilize that area. I did 5 or 6 days of dockets, and I would hope every chief judge who's kind of in a position of authority would go do these dockets to see exactly what you're dealing with. We had about 500 people show up right at 4 o'clock. Every one of them had suspended licenses. Every one of them were suspended licenses because they didn't pay a fine or a fee. Some went back years. Basically what I did, because I had the power to do it from the clerk there, was just wiped out everything and gave them a D6 reinstatement, which means they could go get their driver's license back. It's about $293, I think, for court costs for a traffic ticket. And then you add the fine to that, which can be $100 to $200. So you've got basically a $400 ticket for people who in many cases aren't making $400 a week. And so it's a substantial burden, and they just ignore it, frankly. And of course, then it goes into collections, and they start assessing these high interest rates. And before the person knows it, a year later, they come back to try to take care of this, and they've got a $1,000 debt that they owe on basically running a stop sign or something like that. So when I sat through the dockets, we did overflow dockets, and I sat through them every morning and every afternoon for 5 straight days. I think there was maybe 1 Caucasian out of probably 300 people that I saw. And so this clearly disproportionately affects poor people, number one, and in that category, minorities. And that was my assessment with bonds. And I was looking at the county jail and wondering, why is somebody in the county jail on a $500 bond? I mean, a bondsman will bond you out for $50 if you can find one to do one at that low rate. And so it just struck me that like a hammer in the head, that we're incarcerating people on low-level bonds who don't pose a danger to the community. Some do, some don't, but a lot don't. And if we're setting a bond at $500, we're saying to the public at large, it seems like to me, well, that person doesn't really pose a significant safety hazard to the community. Why is that person in there on a $500 bond? They're in there because they're poor. And I wanted to see what we could do to adjust that. Since COVID occurred, and because of the scare of an outbreak of COVID in the jails, our jail population in Broward County runs about 3,500 people on any given day. In March 1st, we were at 3,591, and today we're at 2,860. We've reduced the jail population by 1/3 as a result of COVID, because we've held both misdemeanor and felony docket proceedings every night to try to see who really poses a danger and who does not, and who we can let out of the jail, who should not be in there or can come back after this the COVID virus situation kind of stabilizes. With that said, it's not an easy decision. It's easy to say, okay, let's look at their crime, and they're charged with possession of cocaine. Well, that's not really a public safety hazard. So should we just let that person out without any judicial oversight? And that's what I was kind of being pushed in the direction of, and I declined to do it, frankly. And that day after we were having these discussions, someone up in the middle of the state let somebody out on a drug charge. The next day went out and murdered 2 people. So it's not an easy decision just to say, look at their crimes. Let's look more at whether they pose a hazard and can be let out. So that's kind of where I came into all of this on COVID. We've stopped evictions. We've stopped people from being defaulted in answers who are pro se's. In other words, if you don't file an answer in a case, you can't be defaulted. We've stopped foreclosures. So we try to do as many things as we can. But with that said, you know, there's inevitably a push from the other side. A lot of the landlords, you know, they're not big, huge conglomerates. They're people who may just own a few apartments that they're renting, and they pay the mortgage from that rent, and they're not able to collect rents because people aren't working. So it's a difficult decision when we're going to get back, and all that's going to come in front of judges, and they're going to have to decide what to do. And right now, I just thought it's just an awful situation dispossessing somebody in the middle of this. And so we're not doing it. Our order stays in effect till May 29th. And after that, we're just not really sure where we're going to go with this. So we've tried to look as progressive as we can in Broward County, which is a very liberal county, to say what really we need to do to focus on public safety versus trying to make sure that people aren't disproportionately affected by this virus any more so than they are. I mean, there are just tons and tons of people. It's the same in all of y'all's communities where people just aren't working, and they're not going to be able to catch up for a while. So that's kind of where we are in Broward County, and that's how I kind of got involved in some of these issues.
Thank you so much, Judge. And actually, I have a quick follow-up question for you that came from the audience. Can you briefly describe what authority there is for judges in Florida to waive fines and fees?
Okay, that's a complicated issue. A lot of that came up, and some of you are aware, with Amendment 4, restoring felons' voter rights. That thing sounded like it was going to be easy, and then it turned into a whole mushroom of court actions. We have jurisdiction to resolve the fines and fees, or to eliminate them, or to reduce them, up until the time we adjudicate the case. Once the clerk gets it and it goes into what's called collections, it's amazing, but a judge doesn't have the authority to pull that case out of collections and wipe it out. Now, luckily, as I said, we have a very progressive clerk who's given us a lot of authority on that. So on driver's license days, we simply pull them out of collections, waive all the fees and fines, and put the person back in square one. And we've done that to, I would say we probably did 1,000 of those cases last year. Just basically gave the person the right to go to DMV, pay the $50 fee, and get your license reinstated. So we have some discretion, but not unbridled discretion, because once we adjudicate it, it's kind of funny. I think that legislature didn't want us to do that, and that's why they gave the clerk the authority to manage the case once it goes into collections. This is a revenue-generating enterprise. We write 500,000 traffic tickets in Broward County alone. And every single one, if you look at where those traffic tickets go, they all go to somewhere. Now, we're not talking about the poor people who don't pay them, but the allocation of the money. It goes to hospitals, it goes to nursing homes, it goes to emergency rooms. That money is spent before the ticket is written.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Stephanie, turning to you, you have been very active in fines and fees reform for several years in California and elsewhere in the country. Can you talk about the advocacy community in California? What has succeeded and what hasn't? And can you also address the issue of juvenile fines and fees and your most recent wins on outstanding debt and how that should help during the COVID crisis?
Great, yes. And I'm gonna share my screen just to help with the presentation. So great, thanks Joanna, and thanks for the ABA for putting on this session. So I work at UC Berkeley School of Law in the Policy Advocacy Clinic, where we've been doing research on fines and fees in the juvenile and criminal systems for several years now. And we're actually working very closely with Debt-Free Justice California, which is a coalition focusing on putting a stop to the unfair ways in which the criminal system essentially extracts wealth from vulnerable communities, and particularly communities of color. So Anthony and I work very closely together on a day-to-day basis. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that's looked like pre-COVID, some of the work that we've done, but also now that COVID-19 has hit, some of the advocacy that we're doing now and how that's different from what we were doing before. So prior to COVID-19, a lot of our work was focused on legislation at the local and state level. Over the last couple of years, our members of the coalition have been able to successfully advocate for the elimination of fines and fees in the criminal system. So in San Francisco, Alameda, Contra Costa, and Los Angeles, they all have ended the assessment and collection of criminal fees and discharged collectively. And again, Joanna hinted that some of the numbers are hard to track, but we're estimating around over $2 billion in criminal fees. So that's a lot. There are some fees that are authorized at the state level. So we are working with Senator Holly Mitchell on Senate Bill 144, which would end the assessment and collection of about 50 different fees that are currently charged to people in the criminal system. And it would also discharge all associated debt. That bill had passed through the Senate. We were gearing up for budget discussions and going through the Assembly, and then COVID-19 hit. So our advocacy efforts have since changed a little bit. In some ways, the bill, Senate Bill 144, has become more timely. As many of us have said, the public health crisis and the ensuing economic crisis have only made the need for debt relief that much higher. But our normal advocacy tools, which has been primarily through legislation and litigation, have been disrupted in some ways. Many legislatures have suspended their sessions. A lot of courts have closed or reduced their capacity significantly. So our ability to make change in those normal methods have been disrupted. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the different ways in which we in California have been able to push different actors, and I'm going to go branch by branch of government and use California to illustrate some of the opportunities for reform that we have even in this moment. So I will start with kind of where we started in the coalition, and that's with the executive branch. We wrote a letter to our governor in late March asking him to use his existing authority as well as some of his broadened powers after he declared a state of emergency in California to essentially end assessment and collection of all fines and fees. And what that looks like will vary by jurisdiction, but generally I think governors have some powers to suspend statutes and regulations, promulgate rules and regulations regarding private collection agencies. A lot of the debt is often referred to third-party agents, so that's a serious concern for a lot of the people that we talk to. But also there's usually some sort of state collection arm, so whether that's a state taxation agency or state collection agency involved in collection of fines and fees, we've asked the governor to also step in and stop those efforts as well. I don't think a lot of governors have actually taken up asks in this space. I think the only one that I've seen is Governor Reynolds from Iowa, who has suspended at least one of their statutes deeming 30 days of non-payment as delinquent. Whether or not that will continue on, we'll see, but there has been at least one governor that's taken up some action. We've yet to hear from our governor, Governor Newsom, on this issue, which is why we also have appealed to other executive agencies and actors to step up where they have authority to. So for us, what that means specifically is we wrote a letter to our California State Controller, who is in charge of our state collection agency, the Franchise Tax Board, essentially asking what we asked Governor Newsom to do in let's stop the state sanctioned collection of fines and fees. And effective March 27th, we were successful in getting Betty Yee, our state controller, to stop interceptive tax refunds, wage garnishments, and bank account levies for both for juvenile, criminal, traffic, and all infraction-related debt. So we've seen that already happen. Letters have been sent out to all courts and counties saying you can no longer use the Franchise Tax Board as a collection arm. And we've already heard from some of our community members that for the first time in a very long time, their paychecks haven't been garnished. So that's a promising move in California. Turning to legislative, kind of what can the legislative branch do? Again, as I said, most legislatures have been suspended, but if and when they do pick up, I think the signal that most of us have been given, seems to be the case in other states, is unless bills are COVID related, the chances of them moving through or passing are going to be very unlikely. So I think the task for us as advocates and community members who are interested in seeing change on this is to make that direct connection to COVID-19. So there is obviously not a direct public health relationship, but I think the economic tie is clear. People need every single dollar in this moment to focus on keeping their families safe, healthy, fed, and the last thing that they need to worry about is paying off fines and fees and worrying about some of the dire consequences of non-payment, like driver's license suspension or additional sanctions for non-payment. So that's some of the things that we're asking states is to also stop referrals of fines and fees to private agencies and state taxing and collection authorities. Again, the state has not so much wiggle room with most of the legislature suspended, but the other thing that we're trying to raise as a serious concern is with most courts closed, with a lot of collection offices closed, the opportunity to renegotiate payment plans or let a court know that, hey, my circumstances have changed, I need a different amount that I need to pay. Those opportunities are just not there, again, because most of these offices are closed or overwhelmed. If you try to call our franchise tax board right now, I've heard people been on the phone for hours. So practically, there are a lot of procedural due process concerns with negotiating some payment plans or even amounts. So that's kind of at the state. I think there's a little bit more wiggle room at the local level, at least in California. A lot of our cities and counties are still in operation and having weekly meetings. And so we've sent letters to each of our county board of supervisors in the state saying, hey, use your authority to stop assessment and collection of the fines and fees over which you have some discretion. So again, we've asked them to suspend the assessment and collection, to stop referring fines and fees to either private or the state collection agencies. And another thing that we've asked, which Joanna mentioned is kind of the gold standard, is let's write off all debt that we know is uncollectible, both because most of the people in the system can afford to pay it, but a lot of this debt is just really, really old and has become stale over time. In California, we've talked to counties where some of the debt on the books is as old as the 1970s. Is it really in the interest of the county to still be collecting this money, knowing that people are hitting hard times? We're still waiting to hear back from some counties in California. We have 58, but at least 3 of them have stepped up and indicated that they're actually intending to make some changes in the juvenile fee space. So California, prior to COVID-19, we actually were able to end the assessment of all juvenile fees to young people and their families. That bill that was passed, unfortunately, didn't touch all outstanding fees or old debt that people may have had. So on the map on the slide, the orange counties, which are 22 of them, represent counties that are still actively collecting on old juvenile fee debt. But just this last week, we've heard from Riverside County, San Diego, and Stanislaus, which is our Central Valley County, that they will be introducing resolutions to stop collection, but also discharge all outstanding debt. So collectively, we're looking at about $80 million in relief for families. And what that looks like on an individual level, we've been in touch with a family in San Diego who has about $16,000 in a civil judgment for fees that were charged to him for his son's involvement in the system. And so that now will be a burden lifted off of him and his family so that they can focus on what's important right now. The last thing I'll say about the local level is because a lot of these fines and fees are authorized at the state level and sometimes required, there may not be a whole lot of wiggle room to completely wipe out all the fines and fees that people may be facing. So there still may be a need to go back to the state, but there is some room at the local level, depending on your jurisdiction, for some reform in this space. The last branch, and that's just a copy of the Riverside resolution in case you're interested. The last branch that I'll talk about, and Judge Tuter kind of talked a little bit about what he's done in Florida, so I won't spend too much time, but I think the ask that we've made to all of our courts in California is where you have discretion, waive assessment and stop assessing fines and fees, stop interest accrual and cease all of the consequences for non-payment or late payment, like arrest warrants, contempt of court, whatever it may be. I think we've seen some movement. Some of the courts in California have suspended payment dates for fines and fees. In Oregon, which is the flyer shown here on the slide, they've suspended certain collection fees, are no longer suspending driver's license, and have encouraged their judges to waive and suspend fines and fees. And the last state that I'll highlight is Delaware, which has suspended active collection of criminal, civil, and traffic assessments. So I think in all of the branches, it seems like the judicial branch is honestly making the most movement at the moment. But I think we're encouraged by recent actions in California that the executive branch and some of the local level governments will step up as well. And last thing, I know Joanna mentioned this, but I encourage you, if you want more detail about what different stakeholders and different levels of government can do, please check out the Fines and Fees Justice Center website. for what can happen in the criminal fines and fee space. And then on our website, the Berkeley Law Policy Advocacy Clinic, we have one specific on juvenile fines and fees, just in case people want that as a resource. But I'll turn it back to you, Joanna.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Anthony, you've also been a leading advocate in California for fines and fees reform. What would you like to see happen to address fines and fees during this crisis?
I think there needs to be an immediate suspension of all government debt collection. We got that from the Franchise Tax Board to stop intercepting wages and tax returns, but not for child support. But I think the governor, at least in our state, needs to go beyond and include child support and just stop the collection of fines and fees, and stop imposing them, which I don't think they can, because there's no court, there's no traffic court, and hardly any. Well, there's still some criminal court going on, so stop the imposition of those fines and fees. Here in LA County, we were part of a coalition called Let's Get Free, and we were able to eliminate all county-imposed criminal system fees back in February. We're developing a letter. We just drafted the letter, and we're getting sign-ons right now to send to the board of supervisors, so they can send a memo to the judges and the courts, letting them know that, you know, this has happened, and to stop imposing fees, just to make sure it's being implemented at this time. Another thing too is there's another letter that we're co-signatories on with public counsel here in LA that one went to the local court circuit about reinstating driver's licenses and and suspending collection of those fines and fees, and people with unpaid fines should have their licenses reinstated. And the presiding judge, Kevin Briscoe, issued a memo on April 10th to reinstate driver's licenses for people with unpaid fines in LA County. But the implementation process has been really really inaccessible. People are calling, and they're calling the collection agencies, like what's the GC services down here, and they're saying their offices are closed during the pandemic, so people with fines that have gotten collections can't handle that. Some of the traffic court clerks have gave people like arraignments later down the road, so they can have driver's license suspension relief. So once they get that arraignment or that extension, then they can go and get their license back. But the DMV, it's really hard for people to actually get a hold of a traffic clerk, to then figure out what's going on in the case, and then after get a hold of whether they have to get a hold of GC services and DMV, because everybody's closed down and nobody's coordinated. Nobody's coordinating the courts, the collection agencies, the DMV. And so people aren't getting this license suspension relief. And then like in my case, personally, I don't know if I'm eligible, because mine's in collections already for failure to appear, and I have an arraignment down in July. So I don't even know if I'm eligible, but I'm gonna try. But we're writing a second letter to the presiding judge in LA County to, there's a couple of demands. One of them is for the courts to send a memo to, or at least an explicit directive to all traffic court clerks to give extensions and arraignments for people who have outstanding debt or whatever outstanding cases, so they can be eligible for this license suspension relief. And to make the system, there's a couple of demands just to make the overall implementation process easier, and so people could access this relief so they can get the licenses back. Because right now, on paper, they can, but it's not happening just because everything's closed down and nobody's coordinating.
Great. Anthony, you brought up an interesting issue, which is the lack of coordination. Judge Tuter, what are the obstacles to broader COVID fines and fees responses in Florida to address the lack of coordination? Is there a statewide solution that's possible?
Probably not. Our governor here has been very active in entering executive orders on some of these things we've been talking about. But I think the notion that any legislature is simply going to abolish fees and fines because you're poor. I don't think that's going to sell in any legislature, because they're going to basically say, well, that means because you're poor, you can violate all the traffic laws and speed, and you don't have any consequences from that kind of behavior. I think Florida particularly, I had a long conversation with our Chief Justice on Friday. We are such a large state, from Key West to Pensacola. It is just such a large geographic state that some areas of the state are disproportionately affected by COVID, and others have had only a few cases. And so this idea that it's kind of one law would fit all of the circumstances really, I don't think is realistic. I think what the Chief Justice in our state has done is said, there are 20 circuits, 20 chief judges. You chief judges got to kind of decide what's important and what you need to do in your circuit, and we'll back you up. And so I don't think on the fees and fines that it's realistic that we're going to have any kind of a statewide resolution of this, unless the governor were to issue some kind of an order saying that we would not collect fees and fines. But for the most part, as the young lady pointed out from California, there are no offices open. There's nobody collecting fees or fines. And in our jurisdiction, there's nobody in jeopardy that their license is going to be suspended. But Anthony is right. I think, I don't know what the sense of normalcy is going to be in a court system when we re-enter, or when we get back to work in the courthouse and things are on. The lines are probably going to be out the door. People are going to be fearful that they missed a deadline or they didn't do something and they need to make it up. But I think more apprehension is going to be that people are going to probably put the fees and fines portion of their life in the background and go to work because they haven't worked in weeks. And this is going to, once again, kind of escalate into the unintended consequences of you losing your driver's license, or you're driving on a suspended license or a revoked license, and now you get arrested and you actually go to jail. So I don't think in our state there's a statewide solution unless the governor was inclined to do it by executive order. And as I said, when you have some areas where they've had 28 people tested positive and nobody's died, it's unlikely that they're going to just make a solution there that's kind of looking for the problem. But it's a terrible thing. I mean, I don't know what the ultimate solution is. Maybe one would be that after a disposition or adjudication, the defendant fills out some kind of a financial information form, like you do when you're pro se and you want to avoid the filing fee to file a lawsuit, and get something under oath that they're unable to pay. But this idea that basically what happens is, we just go through thousands of these cases a month, and sometimes they show up, most of the time they don't. And you just end up with fines against people that they may or may not get the notice that they're fined, or they may or may not care. And then it escalates into a situation where they're ultimately arrested because they're trying to go to work and they have a suspended driver's license. So we've got to come up with some more creative solutions. I know these folks who are working in California are thinking about it, but there has to be a better way to do this. Just basically suspending somebody's driver's license because they're poor, it just escalates their life cycle where they can't go to work, and it impacts their whole family. And something better has got to come from this. But I just don't think you're going to sell to legislatures. We'll just wipe out all these fees and fines for a disproportionate segment of the population, which is people that are poor or minority, because they are collecting a whole bunch of this money from other people, and that's going to other parts of the criminal justice system that are helping to fund it.
Right. We got a question from the audience, which is, what is the percentage of imposed fines and fees that go uncollected, and what is an alternative source of revenue for a state or locality? And the person notes that they're asking because in their jurisdiction, the jurisdiction increases fines and fees instead of increasing taxes. And I would just start this conversation as, fines and fees are an incredibly regressive way of funding government. It is not according to people's means, and in fact, it disproportionately falls on poor communities and communities of color. So it's an extremely regressive way of funding government. And at the Fines and Fees Justice Center, we feel strongly that the judicial system, which is the third branch of government, is a core government function. It's meant to serve everyone, and it needs to be funded equitably by everyone. And so it should be funded from general revenue, just as we do the executive and legislative branch. So that would be my response. You know, Judge Tuter, do you want to add anything to that? Do you have any other response for how should we be funding? What should be an alternative source of revenue for a state or locality instead of fines and fees?
If you're adjudicated a convicted felon in the state, let's just say you had cocaine and you pled no contest or you pled guilty to it, whatever the disposition was. The fines, I think, on that range about $400 to $600, depending on where you are, when you are. If you get a traffic ticket for running a red light, as I said, it's $293 in court costs, plus about $175 on the citation. So it's almost as much as the fine you get when you're adjudicated a felon. And, you know, when the only data I have is when we started looking at Amendment 4, how many of these felons have paid whatever they were assessed. And this, of course, varies year to year to year. And in 1970, it was $50. But as you look at it in the context, only about 8 or 9% of these individuals ever pay it. But as I said, you're just not good. I don't care what state you're in. I don't think you're going to get a stomach for somebody saying, we're just going to wipe it out. I think you'd better have a better opportunity, which we would like, is to put them on community service of some kind, let them work it off for $10 or $20 an hour and wipe it out that way. I think you'd have a better way convincing people to do that. But you're still right back at the same situation. If you're not collecting it and you're spending enormous amounts of time putting this into collections and having hearings, I just question the sanity of it, really.
You know, I would actually just want to add a comment to what you're saying about felony fines and fees in Florida. You know, for certain drug convictions, if you have, for example, 11 Percocet in your pocket, you are considered violating felony distribution in Florida, and that comes with a $50,000 fine. And so converting that to community service is not necessarily a viable alternative. And so I think we should really question whether or not a fine on top of incarceration serves any purpose. And Stephanie, could you talk a little bit about alternatives to fines and fees? One of the questions from the audience was, if we don't want to use fines and fees for traffic violations, and we can talk about, or other kinds of violations, what other kind of punishment do you propose?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it honestly depends on, I think we're talking about fees, we're talking about fines, we're talking about restitution, we're talking about what type of debt we're talking about. Fees are meant to recoup costs. So, I think this gets to the question about, we're not imposing taxes on people. And so people have resorted to fees as a way to generate revenue. Is that something that we, want to do in our counties, cities, courts? That's a question. And I think, Joanna, you're right. I think our position is we should be pulling from the general fund. Fines, I think, is, I think the intention of fines is to be about punishment with the idea of deterring future behavior. Whether or not that actually functions in practice, I think you're getting at is, $50,000 for whatever the crime may be as a fine. That means means something to one person who is making, who knows, $1 million, $2 million. That $50,000 fine for a person who's making $20,000 a year is a completely different situation, and probably not going to deter either of them from acting in the future. So I think, we're collectively talking about alternatives, but I don't think there's a good solution. I know people talk about day fines as a solution, which is the kind of system in Europe where you adjust based on people's ability to pay or income. But I think the research that has been done so far has questions about whether that's actually feasible or not, especially in the US, where we know people of color in particular, and Black and brown people, are consistently policed, over surveilled, over punished. And so you throw that layer on top of it, anything about adjustment of income is kind of moot too. But I know Anthony probably has some thoughts.
Anthony,
Yeah,
let
well,
me give you a minute to respond, and then I want to shift the conversation over, okay?
Okay, yeah, there's two different things. Fees should be completely eliminated because they're not a punishment, they're not anything, they're just the government recuperating costs for off the backs of poor people and people of color who are over policed and over punished, as Stephanie stated. As in terms of fines, yeah, it's different. It's harder to figure out a way to really address that situation, but we know for sure that the current system of fines is ridiculously unjust and over punitive for low-income people and people of color, and it doesn't deter future behavior. So we do need to figure out a different solution. What that solution is, I think we're also trying to find and create. And if anybody has ideas or other models that they've seen, I think we'd all be happy to hear about them.
That's great. I was going to shift over to enforcement, but actually we have a question from the audience that I'd like to address. The question is, even if they put a hold on fines and fees, what happens when courts reopen and the hold ends? Do you just have to start paying your monthly amount again? Or do you owe the amount of the payments that were missed? Isn't there a high likelihood of a crisis when the courts reopen?
Well, when we reopen, Joanna, we have tolling orders and orders we request from the Supreme Court. So all of this is essentially stayed. You're not going to incur anything else that you had prior to this, but it will be right back when we reopen and courts kind of resume normal activities. You're going to be in the same situation as you were before they closed. You're still going to owe the debt. So I think a lot of these, I mean, listen, I can just see for months and months and months, we're going to have hearings about the COVID-19 and how it affected my family, and I couldn't do this, and I wasn't working, and I couldn't pay my rent, and I was caring for my sick relatives. These are just going to be enormously difficult decisions down the road, but you're not in really any harm's way with the courts closed, at least in my state. And it would, you'd pick up right where we start off, and you'd be in the same posture as you were before the courts were closed.
Anthony or Stephanie, do you have anything else that you want to add to that?
I guess the only thing I'd add is, and I think it sounds like Judge Tuter, that you're, doing better on this than some of the courts that we've seen in California, where, they're still accepting online payments. They haven't suspended any payment obligations or things like that. I think the other thing that's of concern is, even if we have a stay of payments, depending on the state that you're in, outstanding fees, fines may actually extend your time on probation, or have other consequences. So I think that's another question that has come up. And our franchise tax board kind of moratorium ends July 15th, and I know that our coalition is going to be talking about what does that look like when we're in May and June? What are our next steps in terms of whether that's extending this, asking for other types of relief? I think all of us can say we're in uncharted territories and just don't know what are the methods to be utilizing, or what are the asks that might work. But I think hopefully we have 214 people on this ABA webinar. We can collectively think together and come up with some creative ideas.
Thank you. Anthony, I'm going to turn to you on a new topic. I want to talk about enforcement of stay-at-home orders. Have you, and social distancing orders, have you heard about people being ticketed for violating any of these stay-at-home or social distancing orders? And what do you think about, are there any worries about threat of citation or arrest of people for violating these orders?
So yeah, we've heard stories, like secondhand stories of people being ticketed, and this was early on, like when the first stay-at-home order was introduced. But I haven't, and I don't think anybody in our organization knows anybody personally that has actually been ticketed or cited. Not that I know of, at least, but we have heard like secondhand stories, and I have heard of people being stopped if they're with more than two people in a car or walking. There was one specific incident where there's 3 people in a car going to the store, and they were stopped by the police, and the police told them, you don't need more than 2 people to go to the store. Why are you're not practicing social distancing? I think they might have been cited or told them to go home or something. But And then in South Central, actually, there was a one of our students at our high school that we have at our space. One of their friends, because they shared it with us through Instagram, and because their friend recorded it, they were at a 1-year-old's birthday party, and this was like the first weekend that the stay-at-home order was put in place. They're having a 1-year-old's birthday party in South Central, and you know, there was probably like 20 to 30 people there. And the cops actually went in the backyard and physically removed people out of the backyard, and like were like in riot position, and pushing people, and like started doing like that little step move that they do in unison and stepping people away. And so like it was almost like it looked like a riot was about to erupt or something, because the cops literally just removed people from a home and threw them out into the street and just told them just to keep backing them and backed them all the way up to like a whole block. And so that was really kind of scary to see that. But that's what we've seen here. The parks, you know, the LA County Parks and Recreation said, you know, you could use our parks and stuff like that, just practice social distancing, like wear the mask or stay 6 feet apart. So it is a worry, especially because we know people of color are over policed, and poor people over policed, and people that have to go to work. Right now, essential workers, a lot are people of color and working. Like my dad is still working, my brother's still working, my sister-in-law is still working. They have permits that they can be traveling and stuff like that and be out. But what if you're out somewhere or whatever and you don't have that permit? You know, what's gonna happen? You're gonna get cited, you're gonna get fined. And the governor has stated, and the mayor has stated, that they're not going to use a criminal justice approach to a public health issue, but you know, they have that ability to do that. So we're monitoring it.
Thank you. Stephanie, are there particular problems with respect to youth and efforts to enforce these orders against them? And I also just want to highlight an example that I just came across this week. I'm going to massacre the name of this town. The city of Fond du Lac, which is in Wisconsin, now issue an order that they can fine children as young as 12 for violating stay-at-home orders.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's concerning. And that example, I think it's like $90 for 12 and 13-year-olds and $187 for 14 to 16, and it increases with the age. And so, again, I think this comes back to the idea of fines, or these fines are supposed to be sort of a punitive function, but we know from research on from developmental psychologists and neuroscientists that young people, in terms of their brain development, that doesn't happen until into their mid-20s. And so teenagers' perception of risk and reward doesn't allow them to always fully appreciate the consequences of their actions. And so the idea of fines as a deterrent for young people, I don't know if that's actually going to be accomplished. I think the other thing that's concerning about whether it's imposing fines on young people or arresting them for violating shelter-in-place orders, is it's not just the young person who's impacted. Their parents and guardians are inevitably involved, whether that's having to go to court and deal with the disposition of their child, or sometimes in many states they're often jointly and severally liable for the same fines and fees that the young person is. And so you're just expanding the group of people who are going to suffer the collateral consequences of some of these enforcements. And the last thing I'll say is Anthony's point is, we know that enforcement of these orders are not going to be uniformly applied. There's bias in policing and punishment. And so the idea that a young person sitting at a park with his friends is going to be treated the same way as a Black teenager who maybe is housing unstable and has nowhere to go, we just know that the enforcement is going to play out on existing racial disparities in the system.
Judge Tuter, have you seen any citations or arrests for violating COVID-related orders? And how would your court handle one of these citations? Or are you hearing low-level citations at all right now?
Well, astonishing enough, when this came out, we as chief judges were informed that there's a Florida statute dealing with this, section 381, which says any person who violates any rule under this section, or any isolation or quarantine, or any required adopted Department of Health in accord with a declared state of public emergency, commits a misdemeanor in the second degree. which would be, in this case, a no bondable offense. So there's a state statute, so there's no municipal ordinances really on this. We have not had a single case or anybody cited, arrested, whatever that I know of in Broward County. I do know in the chief judge's call, someone up in Martin County, which is Jupiter, was given a citation by one of the police departments up there for violating the social distancing or whatever it was. And there was a church in the center of the state that got some notoriety where, I don't remember if it was the mayor or whoever it was, but he sent the entire sheriff's department out to a church who was holding a congregation session. They cited some people, they took down license plate numbers of others. So that's been kind of what I've heard about and known from Florida. The law enforcement is in a horribly difficult position. I mean, these are not, kind of public safety crimes. Another instance, we had somebody, some kids in a Publix, a grocery store, threw a bunch of stuff on top of a whole bunch of fruits and vegetables and telling everybody they had the virus. They had to throw out $35,000 worth of fruits and vegetables from the store as a result of this. So it's not an easy thing. What I grapple with, and some of these people are my friends, mayors and county managers and city managers, who are just putting out these kind of draconian laws and rules. I don't know where their power comes from to do this, that most of those folks are under a county charter or a municipal charter. I'm governed by the state constitution, the governor is by the state constitution and the US Constitution. So I just think in some instances, I'm just wondering whether some of the things they're doing, they have the power to do, so to speak. And so everybody's so in fear of what's going on that we kind of all accepted that as a normal way of life right now.
Thank you. There's just one final topic that I want us to all take a moment to discuss, and that's really turning to the long-term impacts of this crisis. In 2008, as the Great Recession hit the public sector, as we talked about, we saw fines and fees increase, both the number imposed and the amounts assessed. And without a doubt, state and local governments, their budgets are going to be very hard hit by COVID, and many already have. How do you think we prevent government from turning once again to fines and fees as a way of, as plugging holes in the budget? And Stephanie, I'll start with you.
Yeah, no, and I think the concern is legitimate. In 2009, we saw several counties in California, like you said, increase their amounts. Just to give a concrete example, Alameda County, which is Oakland, an average probation burden was $250 in 2008. 2009, they increased things tenfold. So we're looking now at a $3,000 fee burden for families. So it's a very real concern to have. I think that's why it's so important that, in our efforts to request suspension, the kind of short-term relief, we're also not kind of hiding the ball, that we are looking for permanent change in this space. Fines and fees was an issue before COVID happened. The same economic harms were happening. It's just been exacerbated by, the job losses, the reduction in work, obviously everything that's happening. So which is, I think, our point, and, all of the recommendations are pointing to is, not just stopping collection, but wiping everything off of the book so that counties can't easily restart collection on accounts, and not just, in practice, stopping assessment, but also getting those laws off the book so it won't be that easy to turn back to them when if and when this crisis is over. I think we've been asking concretely in all of our letters to courts, the governor, and counties to commit to not introducing legislation that would increase fines and fees and amounts. And I think, in our communications, I hope we're signaling that we're going to be vigilant and that we're going to be following up and saying, hey, these are the counties and places that are doing good things. Do you still want to be on the wrong side of what's happening? And so I think that's just something that we can all do, is continue to put pressure on actors to consider about, like, what are the impacts that are being had on communities.
Yeah, and I think, you raise a very good point, that there's really two pieces of this. There's the concern that fines and fees could be raised, in the wake of the crisis as a way of generating more revenue. But there's also the temptation, and I've started to see trickles of this happen in some towns and villages of turning to existing debt that's on the books, which we know has been uncollectible often for years and years because people simply don't have the money and are less likely to have the money after this. And the concern that we're going to have to do more and more draconian things, that government will do more and more draconian things to try to collect money that's very difficult to collect because people simply don't have it. So I think it's a very good point. Anthony, I think you were looking to add to this?
I think you just hit the nail on the head that people are going to be less likely to pay any of these fees and outstanding debt after this crisis. And I think one positive thing out of this crisis, I think, is that there's a lot of understanding from government, from people in power, that people are suffering right now. Unlike like the 2008 recession, where the banks and the people at the top of the financial industry weren't the ones held liable. It was people applying for homes that they couldn't afford. The problem was shifted to the people. But I think in this situation, we understand that the government and the people in power understand that it's really nobody's fault and people need relief. And so I'm hoping that kind of understanding, that kind of sentiment outlasts this moment into the future, and we see each other differently and see the plight that poor people and people of color go through differently. And I also think people could just look at what's happened in California and in counties like San Francisco and Alameda, Contra Costa, and especially LA County, because they're so large. We eliminated juvenile fees back in 2009. Well, there's a moratorium and they've been eliminated now. And we've just recently eliminated criminal system fees for the county. And we have the largest DA's office in the country, the largest probation office in the country, the largest sheriff's department in the country, and the largest jail system on the planet. And if we could eliminate our local county imposed fees, I mean, I think we can do that anywhere. And then the question of fines, I mean, that's something we have to tackle next. But this fees question is something that's proven a little bit more difficult than we expected it to be. So once we do this, I think we can move on to fines. And I think the country should be looking at what's happening in California.
Thank you so much. And Judge Tuter, just turning it back to you really quickly, I think this is a long-term crisis, and you've seen in normal times some of the impacts of fines and fees and the collateral consequences from fines and fees that we see and disproportionately hitting poor communities and communities of color. And we know that those are the same folks who are being really disproportionately harmed in the current crisis. But the economic impacts of this crisis are going to last a long time. So how do we make sure that some of the reforms that are being put in place in light of the crisis are going to last through the duration as people try to dig out of the economic harms that they're suffering right now?
Well, we have a state whose revenue is significantly dependent upon tourism. There's a tax on a rental car, there's a tax on a hotel room. Everything that is tourism helps fund our state. And with this shutdown, and I think it's going to be the same in many states, many large states, California, you are going to see enormous budget shortfalls when they start do revenue estimating for the next fiscal year, and they're going to look to cut everywhere they can. I don't think in Florida, we have a fairly progressive Senator Brandes, who's the president of the Senate here, and Governor DeSantis as well, who have been open that we need criminal justice reform in the state. I don't see them increasing or trying to gain revenue off this, but I do, what you said struck a chord with me. I think what you're going to see more is at the local level, where you have maybe a clerk's office whose budget is dependent upon collecting fees and fines and those kinds of payments to run their office. And you're going to see maybe more of this kind of enforcement action at the local level than you will at the state level. I just don't foresee our state government trending towards trying to increase these fees and fines because, as we pointed out, in just so many cases, they're uncollectible, so they can't depend on that revenue in any instance.
Okay. Stephanie, what can advocates do to try to help make sure that some of the reforms that we're seeing in light of the crisis to diminish the burden of fines and fees right now, given that this burden is going to go on for a long time and people's economic circumstances are going to be much worse in the wake of the crisis? What can advocates do to help local government make sure that that shortfalls in the budget are filled equitably?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, being vigilant, monitoring wherever you're at, local, city, county, state, hearings, anything that's happening on this issue. I think the one thing that the Debt Free Justice California Coalition has been doing, and I think is often even more successful than some of the data and evidence about uncollectability, is the harm that's being done to people. The fact that there's a San Diego family that has $16,000 in fees, an Orange County family that has $14,000, like that speaks volumes to people in ways that even me saying 8% collection rate over time versus 3%, like that isn't as effective. So I think the one way that we may be able to still, stand our ground and make reform is to lead with those stories. Yeah.
Thank you. And that actually brings me to my very final question, Anthony. For people who are suffering from fines and fees right now, what role can they play in advocating for more just solutions in the long term?
Yeah, I think just for sure joining a local organization that's working on these issues, sharing their stories, how it's impacting their families and them as people, as personally, and I think just really, yeah, just sharing their stories and joining an organization that's working on this locally. And so for us, like, we have a survey out right now that's going out. We're collecting stories of how people have been impacted by COVID and how it's impacted them through the criminal justice system, whether through incarceration or fines and fees. And we're trying to, build up our campaign to get people released locally, and then also eliminate or suspend fines and fees and stuff. So I think people just need to get involved and just keep their heads up. I know a lot of people are worried, and like I said earlier, I'm just hoping this kind of sympathy or this sentiment can be extended beyond just this moment, and that we really work towards solutions after this.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all the panelists for sharing your time with us and helping to have this discussion about fines and fees in the wake of the COVID crisis. There's definitely some encouraging trends, but I think that they need to be extended more broadly, and I think we all need to continue to think about how to do that and how to take some of the best practices and help extend those to places around the country, and think long and hard about how this is going to impact us in the long term. So thank you all. And Allie, I want to turn this back to you, and I just also want to thank the ABA.
And thank you so much. On behalf of the section of Civil Rights and Social Justice, we'd like to thank you all for joining this free rapid response webinar. And we'd also like to express our gratitude to this esteemed group of panelists. You are all doing such critical work, and we thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to share your experiences. The section provides free webinars and resources for legal professionals and advocates nationwide. We hope this helps your work. And again, if you can, please consider joining and becoming an active member of the American Bar Association and the section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. Alternatively, we also hope you consider making a charitable gift to support our work in protecting and advancing human rights, civil liberties, and social justice. We hope you will join us in the next COVID-19 webinar series. The next webinar will be tomorrow, April 22nd at 1 p.m. entitled Learning for Students with Disabilities in the Time of COVID-19. You can find information on this webinar and others in the series on the CRSJ webpage. Best of luck in your work, and stay safe, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.